Do you know anything about North Carolina? Civil War? What do you know? Do you know anything? Do you guys know how to be cute? Is that what it is? Oh, goodness. Alright guys, so today, this is probably going to be the only video I make this week, we're going to talk about North Carolina and the Civil War. I'm not going to give you any kind of really specific details. I just want you guys to know a little bit about our state's history and about our involvement in the war, because it's not something that you're probably going to really get to talk about once you get into high school. So, North Carolina came into the war really late. And pretty reluctantly. Really, the only reason we joined was in order to back up the Army of Northern Virginia, which obviously was based out of Virginia under the command of Robert E. Lee. Well, North Carolina had a lot of things going for it, especially when it came to supplies. As the war progressed, it became harder and harder to find supplies. Armies in Tennessee and in the Deep South, they really struggled to the point that they were having to hunt for their meat. They were having to eat wild berries and wild mushrooms, things that they were finding out in the woods. Well, the Army of Northern Virginia would resort to that because Lee himself just absolutely refused. The South had the supplies, but most of them were centered in North Carolina. We still had a lot of active farmland, a lot of slaves. We had the ability to produce a lot of food very quickly if necessary. So, just like all of the other states in the South, North Carolina was primarily agricultural. Most of the people that lived in North Carolina were very poor. There were, of course, the ruling elite, the plantation owners, the politicians, the people that lived out towards the eastern part of the state that were merchants, but the vast majority of people were desperately poor. This is going to play a huge role in the fact that North Carolina is going to wind up kind of regretting getting involved in this conflict in the first place.
Why would North Carolina regret getting involved in the war? That's the real question.
So, from one chrome dome to another, I have to say that most of these people have no reason to be fighting. They're super poor. They don't own any slaves. They're not going to benefit from this conflict. Approximately 180,000 North Carolinians went off to fight. 40,000 of them didn't come home because they got killed. But the rate of desertion amongst North Carolina soldiers was extremely high compared to the other states in the Confederacy. And most of them came home to support their families. But of course, that's not the case with everyone. Some people returned home and turned to a life of crime. They formed roving bands of raiders that traveled back and forth, and they were stealing from people. They were hurting their fellow statesmen, their fellow North Carolinians, by stealing from them. They would show up at people's houses. They would raid their houses, raid their crops. They would even sometimes murder people who tried to resist. The people who came back in order to feed their families began to resent this. And on top of that, the state started taxing landowners and slave owners per slave. So if you owned 1,000 slaves, you paid way more tax than the guy who owns 10. This is going to turn the war effort into being super unpopular with both the rich and the poor. And it's going to make people regret signing up to fight for the Confederacy. A student asked me earlier that she thought Sherman just marched to Georgia. Well, in 1864, Sherman did march to Georgia. He cut a 10-mile long, 30 to 50-mile deep path every single day on his way down to Atlanta. When he gets to Atlanta, he burns the city, he marches to the coast, and he turns around and he comes back up north towards the Union. And guess what's in between him and the Union?
I don't know. What's in between him and the Union?
The Carolinas.
Oh boy.
But not to worry, North Carolina escaped relatively unscathed, because by the time Sherman marches up through South Carolina, North Carolina is ready to surrender. Sherman's invasion of North Carolina only lasts about 2 months, and it goes all the way from Asheville to Fayetteville and all the way into New Bern and Wilmington. Sherman absolutely conquers North Carolina because the North Carolinians pretty much are just ready to give up. But of course, there's holdouts. The last Confederate victory in the Civil War takes place in Davidson County. Actually, Davidson and Rowan County, where Old Highway 29 crosses the Yadkin River. Where the river and Old 29 meet, there are two bridges. Well, there's three now, but there used to only be two. The one is the old Wilcox Bridge that was built by a family in Winston around the turn of the century and then updated over time. The other one is a train trestle, and the original train trestle that was there, that was in the same spot, dated all the way back to before the Civil War. Well, we all know Sherman and his love of tearing up train tracks. He dispatched 1,000 soldiers under a lieutenant colonel to meet the Confederate forces at this train bridge and destroy it. This trestle was super important to North Carolina. It was one of the largest train bridges in the state, and Sherman wanted it destroyed. Well, after about 17 hours of fighting and about 16 losses on the Union side, 2 losses on the Confederate side, the Union soldiers pulled back to Salisbury and determined it just wasn't worth it. This is the last Confederate victory in the South. The war had technically ended 3 days prior to this when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Well, this site, because of its naturally high elevation, it's basically a hill with a cliff face that overlooks a beautiful spot on the Yadkin River, eventually becomes a favored site for picnics and then a campground, and then home to a fine dining restaurant and nightclub that by the 1980s will have burned to the ground, and the site has sat empty since then. You can go visit it. There's walking trails. They just put in 3 miles of trails there. You can fish under the bridge if you have a fishing license. There's boat access as well. It's a very nice spot, and the county is looking to preserve it and restore the battle site so that people can do reenactments and that they can bring some of that Civil War history back to Davidson County as a tourist attraction. So the very first thing that's visible when you pull up is this giant restaurant sign that used to say York Hill Restaurant on it. The second thing is the burned out remains of the building, including the front stairs that are covered in a stone facade. There's not much left because they've been actively clearing the site for the last few years. The road heading to the top is pretty boring and uneventful. The brick sign off in the distance with the 2 white circles says York Hill Campground at the top of the hill, and it faces out over the river. The top is still visible where they had cut trenches into the side of the mountain, and you can see the stonework on the cliff face where they had sharpened it to keep people from climbing. The top of the hill is off limits, even though it is the old campground, because it's private property. So if you go, please make good decisions about where you walk. So this is the old Wilcox Bridge in this picture and those other pictures. This bridge was built around the turn of the century. The other side of it's a new bridge, and the other side of that bridge is the train trestle. The county is planning on renovating this and turning it into a small museum type area, which I think will be good for Davidson County. If you guys do decide to go, please just be careful and be respectful, because this is, as I said, a site where people did die. It is a battlefield. And so just show it that same respect. That's all I've got for you guys this week. Hopefully next week I'll have something with a little more substance to it. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this and stay in touch.